Calvin's Company of Pastors, Pastoral Care, and the Emerging Reformed Church, 1536 to 1609. We are in chapter 4, which is titled Pastors and Their Households. This is a book by Scott Manetsch, and this chapter is about 22 pages long. It's divided into 3 sections. 1, domestic life. 2, pastors and family relationships. And 3, material support. We'll dive in and work our way through this chapter. So the first section, domestic life, that's pages 100 to 108. This section begins with a theological frame that views worldly ambition and material comfort as fleeting, a theme reinforced by Scripture and abundantly found in early Reformed writers. This chapter opens with the somber tone of Ecclesiastes. Quote, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does a man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun?" That's Ecclesiastes chapter 1. Antoine de Chandieu echoed this in his Auditiones, which mourned the futility of chasing wealth and position. Quote, "Toil without honor, honor without rest, rest without wisdom, wisdom without goodness," unquote. This was more than literary flourish. Geneva's pastors saw their role as calling the faithful away from temporal distractions to a God-centered life. Manetsch writes on page 100, quote, "Commentary against the vanities of the world runs as a leitmotif through many of the sermons and devotional writings of Christian authors in early modern Europe," unquote. Yet these ministers were not ascetics. They lived with their wives and often very large families, certainly by our standards. Examples abound. Antoine de Chandieu had 12 children. Simon Goulart, 9 kids. And Ami Perrin had 5 kids. Manetsch notes, quote, "Life inside Geneva's pastoral households could be noisy, joyful, exhausting, and holy, often all in the same hour," page 101. Ministers took their family duties seriously. Some kept records of their children's spiritual development. One pastor wrote, quote, "I continually watch the progress of my children and note how each one is progressing in the faith and in wisdom," page 101. Pastors' wives also held to very high expectations. Quote, "The wives of Geneva's pastors were typically held to the same standards of virtue, labor, and modesty as their husbands," unquote, page 102. And their honor was linked together with their husbands. The second section, pastors and family relationships, that's pages 109 to 112. This section focuses on where and how pastors lived. Wealthier pastors sometimes came under criticism. Theodore Beza and his wife Claudine Danos were accused of extravagance. Quote, "They outfitted their parsonage more sumptuously," which invited criticisms. "They were living too extravagantly," page 115. In his home, Beza displayed portraits of Calvin, Peter Martyr Vermigli, Wolfgang Musculus, and even 2 of himself. That's page 115. Ministers served the 3 city churches. Saint Pierre, Saint Gervais, and the Madeleine were expected to live nearby. City officials were very strict about this. From page 115, quote, "The city council frowned upon pastors living too close to one another or inhabiting private homes too far from the churches that they served," unquote. Each pastor had a moral responsibility for his immediate neighborhood. Quote, "Each minister was expected to provide moral supervision and attend to the pastoral needs of the people living in his surrounding neighborhood," page 115. Parsonages were not always ideal, and complaints included Gabriel Tucson, his place was too gloomy. Antoine de la Fay, his place was too noisy, rather. He lived next to a forge. And Charles Perrault, his place was unhealthy and unsuitable for study. These are examples found on page 115. Simon Goulart refused to move, even when officials said his parsonage was very old and ruinous. He believed a move would be very aggravating and hardly beneficial for the general good of the church. In the countryside, housing was even worse. Many ministers lived in run-down former Catholic properties. The home in Jussy was so bad, a wall collapsed. Jean Chapuis nearly lost his wife over the conditions that he lived in. The Passy pastor said the filth was ruining his eyesight. Jean Gros had no house in Chancy at all. These are all examples on page 116. Referring to Jean Gros on page 117, quote, he still has no means of lodging in his parish to the great detriment of his ministry, unquote. The company of pastors forced ministers to reside in their assigned villages. They told Gros to live locally so that he might, quote, gain a more personal knowledge of his sheep, unquote. That's on page 117. And of course, that seems quite reasonable, that day and age, if accommodations were available. This third section, material support, found on pages 113 to 122. This is the final section. It covers pastoral income and economic hardship. Geneva had a structured salary system, which is fascinating. So there's three roles: moderator, city pastors, and county pastors. In 1541, to establish a baseline, a moderator was paid 500 florins. City pastors were about half of that, 240 to 300. And country pastors, I may have said county earlier, but country pastors were paid 200 florin. So city pastors were paid a bit more, but moderators were paid the most. Now in 1602 to 1604, moderators were paid 1,000 florins, so their salary effectively doubled. City pastors were paid 800 florins. They were paid 240 to 300 in 1541, so more than doubled. And then country pastors, which were previously paid 200 pesos, florins, not pesos, were paid 500 to 540. So this is all a result of inflation. Manetsch writes, inflation eroded this income. Quote, the buying power of the pastors' salaries actually decreased during the latter half of the 16th century due to runaway inflation, unquote, page 118. Wheat prices tripled from 1575 to 1587. In response, pastors asked for part of their pay in kind, receiving wheat instead of cash. And by century's end, they got 28 coups annually. Quote, the wheat given to the ministers was not always of the highest quality. Indeed, sometimes it was judged extremely bad. That's on page 119. Beza himself struggled in old age. Quote, in 1591, the register of the small council reported that Monsieur Beza is in some need, unquote. By 1592, he had only 200 écus to his name. He, this is Beza, sold his library in 1599 to a Czech nobleman and wrote to Henry of Navarre for help. Other pastors fared worse. Abel Pupin received charity 8 times. Giles Zielschos died of plague in 1574, leaving a family burdened with his debts. Quote, he was leaving poor and burdened with debts without any means to pay them. Beza warned his congregation, and in light of the context, this seems entirely appropriate. Christians are guilty not only of theft, but sacrilege when they refuse to provide support to their poor pastors, page 121. And pastors must not, quote, serve the church for the sake of money, because holy things are not to be sold, unquote. That's on page 122. The chapter ends here with a call to faithfulness in both church and home. Quote, God's work needed to be accomplished in the Christian households as well as in the Christian church. God's will was to be done on earth as well as in heaven. Page 122. The next chapter, chapter 5, is titled Rhythms of Ministry, which is kind of the daily flow of life in Geneva. This is a very good book. If you don't own it, I recommend going out and buying it and reading it and putting together your own summary. Great historical survey of Geneva. So join us next time for chapter 5. We'll see you then.